The small, scorched town of Redemption, Mississippi was a place built on conviction. Its foundations were not laid with bricks and mortar, but with the unyielding certitude of its people, and no one in Redemption was more certain than Pastor Samuel "Sam" Miller. He was not a man of quiet prayer, but of righteous fury, a firebrand preacher whose sermons were as volatile as a flash storm on the Delta. He saw the world in stark, biblical terms of light and shadow, and his mission, he believed, was to call out every shadow he saw, to burn it away with the searing truth of his faith. He believed he was a shepherd, but in his sermons, his voice was more like a sword, cutting through the silence of the old clapboard church at the edge of town. For Pastor Sam, the new shadow was a statue. A gift to the town, it was a bronze figure of the Black Madonna, a striking piece of art that its followers called Our Lady of Healing. It was placed in the town square, a quiet, serene figure in the midst of the town's bustling, often chaotic life. To the faithful who brought her, she was a symbol of hope and a shared heritage, a physical representation of the quiet grace they found in their lives. Her dark, burnished face was a reflection of the dignity they carried. They would leave flowers at her feet, light candles, and say quiet prayers. But for Pastor Sam, the statue was an affront, an abomination. He saw not a symbol of faith, but of idolatry, a graven image that stole the worship meant for God alone. Every time he drove past her on his way to his church, his jaw would clench. He saw not a work of art, but a rival, a silent competitor for the hearts and minds of his flock. His sermons grew more pointed, less about salvation and more about spiritual warfare. He would point toward the square from his pulpit, his voice echoing, and declare that the town was on a precipice, that it needed to choose between the path of true righteousness and the sin of false idols. He often confided in his only daughter, Sarah, a quiet, observant girl of 15. Unlike her father, Sarah was not one to shout her beliefs from the rooftops. She was a creator, a dreamer who spent her time sketching in a notebook, filling its pages with portraits of the people and places she saw in town. She did not share her father's zeal. Instead, she found a strange, unspoken comfort in the peaceful stillness of the statue, the quiet dignity of its dark face. Her father's sermons, once a source of immense pride, had begun to make her uneasy. She didn't understand why people couldn't see the goodness in a symbol of peace. Once, she had even drawn a portrait of the Madonna statue in her notebook, adding a soft, faint halo of light around its head. When her father saw it, he grew cold, his face hardening as he told her in a voice devoid of its usual warmth that she was wasting her talent on a statue that was a sin. The breaking point arrived on a sweltering Saturday in July. The town was hosting its annual summer jubilee, and the square was packed. Families filled the space, vendors sold lemonade and corn dogs, and a band played classic rock on a small stage. The air was thick with the scent of funnel cake and the sound of laughter. Pastor Sam, however, did not attend. He stayed in his office, watching from his window, a grim, determined look on his face. The laughter and joy from the square felt like a mocking celebration of the very things he had dedicated his life to fighting. He saw the statue from his window, a single figure of darkness and serenity amidst a sea of light. He couldn't take it anymore. A plan, reckless and born of years of pent-up rage, began to form in his mind. He wasn't just going to preach against it anymore. He was going to take a stand, to put action behind his words. He drove to a local hardware store, a place he hadn't been in years, and purchased a 5-gallon can of gasoline. His hands trembled as he paid, and he kept his head down, hoping no one would recognize him. As he drove back toward town, the acrid smell of the fuel filled his truck, a scent that was both vile and, in a twisted way, empowering. He parked behind the church and waited, heart hammering against his ribs. He waited until the last rays of the sun had faded and the square was bathed in the warm, inviting glow of the street lamps and carnival lights. He took the can and walked. He moved, not with fear, but with a terrifying certainty. He was doing God's work, he told himself. He was cleansing the town of a sin that was holding it back, that was dividing it, that was threatening to consume it. He reached the Madonna statue and found it surrounded by flickering votive candles and small bouquets of wildflowers. He knelt, not to pray, but to pour the gasoline over the statue's bronze surface. The liquid ran in thick, slick rivulets, a dark, oily shroud. He stood and stared at the figure for a long moment, a match already in his hand. He wasn't a man of violence, not like this. He had only ever used his words to incite change. But words, he had come to believe, were not enough. He was going to light the fire that would burn away the sin. He struck the match. The small flame licked to life, a fragile, trembling thing in his hand. He lowered it, ready to drop it, and watched the statue be consumed by the flames. But just as the flame was a few inches from the gasoline-soaked pedestal, a single, clear, defiant sound rang out. It wasn't a scream or a voice. It was the sound of a church bell. Not the one from his church, which had not tolled in decades, but a different bell entirely, one that sounded as ancient and worn as the earth itself. It rang once, a deep, resonant and chilling tone that cut through the joyful noise of the Jubilee. The sound was so jarring that it made Sam freeze. The match fell from his hand. It did not land on the gasoline-soaked statue. It landed on the grass beside him, but instead of catching fire, the flame turned blue and then winked out entirely, as if something had inhaled it. He stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked around. No one else seemed to have heard the bell over the music. He was alone. But as he stood there, watching the silent, unburned statue, he noticed something impossible. The air, which had been thick with the smell of gasoline, now smelled of jasmine and old roses. He looked at the can in his hand, and then at the statue. The gasoline was gone, not soaked into the statue or the ground, but gone entirely. He stared, then felt a cold fear creep up his spine. He ran, leaving the can behind, running like a man chased by a ghost. The next morning, the town woke up to a mystery. The can of gasoline was found at the base of the statue, but there was no smell of gas and no burn marks on the statue or the ground. A single white rose, fresh and dewy, was found tucked into the statue's folded hands. The story of the pastor's failed attempt at desecration, of the bell that tolled, and the gasoline that vanished, was passed from neighbor to neighbor. No one had seen him, but everyone knew. The fire had been lit, but not in the way he had intended. It had been lit in the hearts of a divided town, and it was a fire that would either unite them or burn them to the ground. The day after the Jubilee, the air in Redemption, Mississippi was thick, not with the scent of funnel cake, but with the cloying silence of shared secrets. The can of gasoline was gone. A young boy, on his way to an early morning baseball practice, found a single white rose at the base of the statue. its petals still dewy with night mist. He didn't touch it. He just ran home and told his father, who told his neighbors, and so the story began its quiet journey, traveling from front porch to front porch, whispered over cups of coffee and hushed phone calls. The town was now split into two camps. On one side were Pastor Sam's loyal followers, a congregation of true believers who had followed his word for years. They dismissed the story as a hoax, a trick meant to discredit their pastor. They painted the statue's followers as heretics and manipulators, spreading rumors of staging and deception. They spoke loudly in the town's only diner, their voices full of a bitter, righteous confidence. On the other side were those who had always been uneasy with Pastor Sam's firebrand sermons and the small, growing community who had brought the Madonna statue to the square. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. They simply went to the square and sat, hands in pockets, gazing at the statue. It was from this quiet half of the town that a new kind of defiance was born. Not a protest with picket signs or angry chants, but a pilgrimage. An old woman named Eleanor, who had lived her entire life in redemption, was the first. She walked the path to the statue in the early morning with a single candle that had belonged to her late husband. She knelt at the base, and in that small act, she seemed to say to the entire town, "I will not be afraid." By the next day, a few more had joined her, silent but present. A young mother pushing a stroller, a retired firefighter, a high school student with a sketch pad. Within a week, there was a small crowd at dawn and at dusk, a testament not just to their faith, but to a collective understanding that something sacred was at stake. The silence of the crowd was what unsettled Pastor Sam's supporters. Their furious words had nothing to push against. It was during one of these evening vigils that a second sign appeared. The town's old church bell, St. Agnes Bell, which had not been rung in over a decade after its rope was worn away, began to toll. Not in a frantic peal, but a slow, deliberate chime, 3 times, deep and resonant. The sound echoed across the valley, carried on a breeze that smelled faintly of old incense and rain. Everyone heard it this time. The vigil crowd at the statue froze, their heads tilted upward. In the diner, the clatter of forks against plates stopped. No one was in the belfry. No one could explain it. The bell rang on its own accord. The mystery deepened when a young journalist, fresh out of college, arrived to cover the story. Her name was Elena Garza, and she was a skeptic by nature. Her editor at the Jackson newspaper had sent her to write a simple human interest piece. She approached the story with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen. She interviewed the locals, but instead of finding emotional hysterics, she found a quiet, grounded faith that surprised her. She spoke to Eleanor, who told her, "Some promises are not written on paper. They are written in stone, in the dirt, and in the heart." Elena, a woman who only believed what she could see, found herself writing a story not about superstition, but about a town that was finding its voice. She wrote her article, but her words were changed. The article was supposed to be a piece on small-town superstition. It became a piece about the miracle on the hill. The piece, published online, was accompanied by a photo of the statue at dusk, its dark silhouette outlined by the flickering light of 100 candles. The article went viral, drawing pilgrims and curious onlookers from across the state. But it also enraged Pastor Sam. He saw it as a mockery of his cause, a public humiliation. He began to organize his own community, preparing for a confrontation that would not be about words, but about action. The showdown came in the form of a public hearing. Pastor Sam, with his well-documented arguments against idolatry, made a formal petition to the city council to have the statue declared a public nuisance and removed. The date was set, and the town prepared for a final, bitter debate. On one side were lawyers and official documents. On the other, only the quiet faith of a few townsfolk. But what Pastor Sam didn't know was that a third force had arrived, a young, skeptical woman with a notebook and a video camera who was ready to capture every word, every lie, and every truth in the room. The stage was set for a public hearing that would divide the town more fiercely than ever before. But no one on either side of the argument saw what was coming. The quiet force that was ready to speak on behalf of the town itself. A voice that had never been heard. A truth that had been buried for too long. A truth that would not be spoken by a man, but by a little girl. A girl who had witnessed all of it from the shadows, watching her father slowly unravel, watching her town slowly tear itself apart. A girl who was waiting for the perfect moment to speak her mind, to tell the town the truth about what she had seen. A girl whose own faith had been forged not in a church, but in the silence of a town square, at the feet of a statue that had spoken to her heart without saying a single word. A girl who was ready to tell her story, and in doing so, to change the course of a town and maybe even heal the brokenness in her own family. The town was ready to fight, but the battle they were about to have was not the one they were prepared for. The city council chambers had the sterile, low-humming quiet of a courtroom. Fluorescent lights washed the room in a cold, unforgiving glow, and the air smelled of stale coffee and polished wood. Outside, the world of Redemption, Mississippi was a swirl of whispers and divided loyalties. But inside, everything was framed in the dispassionate language of ordinances and public nuisance laws. The hearing was a formal battlefield. On one side, seated at a long table with a stack of binders, was Pastor Sam Miller. His suit was meticulously pressed, his tie a deep, somber blue. He looked less like a man of faith and more like a CEO, his face a mask of controlled, righteous fury. On the other side, an equally long table was occupied by a mix of townsfolk. A few were elderly, with hands folded over rosaries. Others were young couples who had been drawn to the gatherings at the Madonna statue, their faces a mix of nervousness and determined hope. The hearing began with the opening statement from Pastor Sam's lawyer, a slick, professional man who spoke with the measured cadence of someone who was used to winning. He presented a barrage of documents, engineering reports, and signed petitions, all arguing that the statue was a public nuisance, a hazard, and, as his closing statement carefully implied, an open invitation to public disorder. The case was presented with clinical precision, a series of undeniable facts designed to dismantle a faith that couldn't be quantified. When it was Pastor Sam's turn to speak, he rose with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed his every word was a stone from the foundation of truth. He didn't use notes. He didn't need to. He began by recounting the history of Redemption, a town founded on the principles of Christian faith. His voice, once a thundering instrument of fire, was now a low, menacing baritone, each word a carefully placed accusation. He spoke of the sacred duty of a community to protect its spiritual purity. He called the statue a graven image, a false idol that had no place in their town. His testimony was a powerful sermon, full of biblical citations and historical precedent. He painted the gatherings at the statue as a breeding ground for superstition and emotional hysteria. As he spoke, he glanced at the faces in the room, searching for the nods of agreement, the silent affirmations he was used to. But the room was quiet. Some of his parishioners nodded, but many of the council members looked down at their notepads, their expressions unreadable. The silence unnerved him. He concluded his statement with a final, desperate plea, a challenge to the council to do the right thing and tear down the idol that was corrupting the town. He sat down, a thin film of sweat on his brow, but still carrying the weight of his conviction. The statue's defenders were next. They had no lawyers, no official documents, just their stories. An old man with a long beard spoke about how the statue had brought a kind of peace to the town that had been missing since the mines closed. A young mother talked about how she found a sense of community at the statue's base that she had never found anywhere else. Their words were heartfelt, but lacked the legal weight and authority of the previous testimony. Pastor Sam listened with a smirk, a look of triumph beginning to settle over his face. This was a battle between fact and feeling, between truth and myth. He was certain he was going to win. But then the quietest voice in the room asked to be heard. Sarah Miller had watched the hearing from the back row, her small frame almost lost in the sea of angry adults. She was not a part of the official proceedings, but she had come with her mother, who was there to support her husband, a quiet, defeated look on her face. Sarah had listened to the arguments, to the accusations, to the lies her father was telling. Her heart ached for him, for the anger that had consumed him, but it also ached for the quiet statue that had brought her so much peace. She didn't plan to speak. She didn't have a speech written, but something in her, a quiet courage that had been building since she first saw the statue, told her she had to. She stood and walked to the front of the room, her small figure a stark contrast to the podium. Pastor Sam saw her and his jaw dropped, a look of shock and betrayal on his face. She didn't look at him. She looked at the council, her eyes clear and unwavering. "My name is Sarah Miller," she began, her voice small but steady, "and I'm here to talk about the statue." The room went completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. She didn't talk about history or law. She talked about the drawings in her notebook, about the colors she used, about the way the statue's face had changed for her. She talked about the way the statue seemed to listen, not to her prayers, but to her heart. She told them about the night her father tried to burn it, about the tolling bell, about the way the gasoline vanished, and the single white rose that was left behind. She spoke not as a witness, but as a poet, as a child who saw things with a clarity that the adults had forgotten. Her testimony was simple, but it was devastating. She didn't accuse, she didn't condemn. She simply laid out her truth, and in that truth, the truth of a little girl who loved her father but could not stand by and watch him be consumed by his own anger. The room saw everything. They saw his pride. They saw his fear. They saw the very thing that had been driving him all along. She concluded her testimony by saying, "The statue didn't ask for our love. It just stood there and waited for us to find it. And when we did, it gave us a voice." She sat down. There were no claps, no shouts, no murmurs. just a heavy, stunned silence that hung in the air like smoke. Pastor Sam stared at his daughter, a look of profound betrayal on his face. He had lost. Not to the lawyers or the old people or the new community, but to his own daughter, to the child he had tried so hard to protect from what he saw as a sinful world. The council, unable to continue the angry proceedings, tabled the vote and called for a recess. The official reason was to consider the new testimony, but everyone in the room knew the real reason. They had seen the truth, and it wasn't in any document. It was in the quiet, heartbreaking words of a child who had seen a miracle and told the world about it. And Pastor Sam, for the first time in his life, was not in control. He had become the fire, and his daughter had become the water, and he had no idea what to do next. The city council's postponement of the vote did not bring peace to redemption. It only intensified the fire. Pastor Sam Miller, once a man whose authority was absolute, now felt it slipping through his fingers like sand. His daughter's testimony, a quiet, devastating truth, had stripped him of his power in a way no political opponent ever could. He was humiliated, not by a rival preacher or a councilman, but by the one person he had tried so hard to protect. The quiet rebellion of the townsfolk, once a distant irritation, now felt like a personal affront. They were not just ignoring him, they were siding with a statue over their own spiritual leader. He felt a profound sense of betrayal, and it turned his humiliation into rage. He decided that if the city council would not act, he would force their hand. He would make the people choose. He announced a public protest against the statue, a demonstration he framed as a final stand for faith and righteousness. He called for a rally in the square, not just to preach, but to demand the statue's removal. His sermons became harsher, his voice cracking with a desperate intensity. He told his congregation that the statue was a poison, and that a poison could only be neutralized by a counterforce. He rallied his loyal followers, promising them that this time they would not be ignored. The day of the protest arrived with the sky a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of rain. The town square became a battlefield of competing truths. Pastor Sam's supporters arrived first, a loud, angry crowd carrying homemade signs with messages like "Jesus saves, not statues," and "faith over idols." They were organized and vocal, their anger a palpable force in the humid air. Facing them was the quiet group of townsfolk who had been gathering at the statue. They didn't have signs, just hands folded in prayer and a stillness that seemed to absorb the angry noise. They stood a respectful distance from the protest, a line of silent witnesses. In the middle of it all, a small, courageous figure stood her ground. Sarah had not told her father she was coming. She stood near the edge of the pro-statue crowd, her notebook clutched to her chest, her eyes fixed on her father. She had a new resolve in her eyes, a kind of peace that was deeper than any fear. She was there not to protest, but to pray for her father, for the anger that had consumed him. She had come to a place of clarity and grace that he had not. Pastor Sam, standing on a makeshift stage, saw his daughter. His eyes narrowed, and a vein in his temple began to throb. Her presence felt like a final, unbearable act of betrayal. He began to preach, his voice amplified by a portable microphone, his words an assault on the statue and everyone who supported it. He called them deceivers, false prophets, and idolaters. His voice, once a source of strength, was now a weapon, sharp and cruel. The crowd was inflamed. They began to chant, their voices a deafening roar. They started to move forward, a wave of anger and frustration aimed at the silent defenders of the statue. The protest turned violent in an instant. The shoving started, then escalated into pushing and shouting. It was a chaotic mess, a collision of two worlds that could no longer exist side by side. People stumbled and fell. Signs were ripped apart. A young man, filled with rage, lunged toward one of the statue's defenders. Sarah, who was standing nearby, saw the man and stepped forward instinctively. She was not trying to defend the statue or the man. She was just trying to stop the violence. In the confusion, the angry man stumbled and fell, and his elbow caught Sarah in the head with a sickening thud. She fell backward, her notebook scattering its pages across the damp pavement, and hit her head on the curb. She lay still, a thin line of blood trickling from her temple. The chaos stopped. The yelling and chanting died down to a stunned, horrified silence. Pastor Sam, who had been shouting into the microphone, froze. His eyes, wide with shock, saw his daughter lying on the ground, a small, broken figure. He dropped the microphone, its feedback a piercing wail that was lost in the absolute stillness of the square. He ran to his daughter, his righteous fury melting into a hot, blinding grief. He knelt beside her, his hands shaking, calling her name. She didn't answer. He picked her up, her small body limp in his arms, and stumbled toward his truck, a man carrying the full, devastating weight of his pride. As he drove to the hospital, his mind was a whirlwind of shame and guilt. He saw his own face in the rearview mirror, contorted with rage, and he realized with a sickening clarity that he had done this. His words, his sermons, his crusade, it had all led to this. His daughter, his light, his one true blessing, was now suffering because of him. The doctors told him that Sarah had a severe concussion and was in a coma. They didn't know if she would wake up. The world, which had once been so black and white, was now a profound, terrifying shade of gray. He had lost everything. Overcome with guilt, he fled the hospital. He ran to his truck and drove. He drove until his mind was a blank slate, his heart a hollow ache. He found himself at the statue in the dead of night, not to destroy it, but to beg. He looked at the serene, dark face of the Madonna statue, and for the first time in his life, he was a man without words. He fell to his knees, not in prayer, but in surrender, and cried out for a sign, for a reason, for a way to undo what he had done. And then he had a vision. The statue's face began to change, not in form, but in expression. Her peaceful, neutral expression turned to one of profound sorrow, her eyes wet with an ancient pain. She appeared not as a judge or a deity, but as a mother, and in her eyes Sam saw his own reflection, contorted with rage and hatred. She showed him a lifetime of anger and a heart that was closed to a love that was not his own. She showed him the pain he had caused in the name of God. And then she spoke. Her voice was not a sound but a presence, a quiet whisper that filled his mind. It said, "My son was betrayed, and you, in the name of his love, have betrayed your own." The vision faded. Sam was left alone in the dark, kneeling in front of the statue, the cold ground beneath his knees, the weight of his sins on his shoulders. The battle was over. He had lost. And in that loss, he had finally found the first fragile crack of a hope he hadn't known he was missing. He had come to the statue to beg for a miracle. He had gotten something else entirely. He had gotten the truth. The town of redemption had fallen silent. The cheers from the Jubilee were a distant echo, replaced by a profound and heavy quiet that settled over the streets and seeped into every home. The hospital felt like a tomb. Pastor Sam Miller, a man who had always commanded a room with his voice, now sat in silence in a plastic chair outside his daughter's room, his hands clasped so tightly they ached. He was a man with no words, no sermons, no certainties. The righteous fire that had fueled him was gone, leaving only the cold ash of his guilt. His wife Lisa had not spoken to him since they arrived. Her silence was louder than any of his loudest sermons, a judgment so pure and so true that he could not bear it. For 2 days, Sarah lay in a coma, her breathing shallow, her face pale. The doctors were baffled. She had no major injuries, no obvious signs of trauma, but she simply would not wake up. On the 3rd day, as the sun began to set, Pastor Sam could not stand the silence any longer. He rose, walked past his wife without a word, and left the hospital. He had nowhere to go, but he knew where he had to go. He drove back to the town square, the Madonna statue, a dark silhouette against the last light of day. He fell to his knees in the same spot where he had knelt with a can of gasoline. He had no words, no prayers, only a single, choked sob that escaped his lips. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the empty air. "I'm so sorry." He looked up at the statue, her face serene and peaceful in the fading light. He had come here to destroy her. He had come here to prove a point. He had come here to save a town he thought was broken, but in the end, he had only broken it more. He had betrayed his daughter, his town, and his own faith. He had to make it right. He had to restore what he had broken. He had to rebuild what he had torn down. He returned to the hospital with a single-minded focus. He found his wife still in the same chair, her face a mask of exhaustion and grief. He knelt before her, his head bowed. "I was wrong," he said, his voice a raw, honest whisper. "I was wrong about everything." She didn't look at him. She just closed her eyes and wept. He didn't press her. He just sat there, a silent, penitent presence, a man who had finally learned the meaning of humility. That night, as he sat by his daughter's bedside, he began to pray. Not the loud public prayers he had always preached, but a quiet, desperate prayer for forgiveness. He prayed for his daughter, for his wife, for his town, and for the statue. He prayed for the first time in his life, not as a pastor, but as a man. And as he prayed, something shifted in the room. The air grew still, and a faint smell of jasmine filled the space. He looked up, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure, a woman in a dark robe, standing in the corner of the room. She was not a vision, not a ghost, but a presence. She was there, watching over them all, a silent guardian of a family that was learning to be whole again. The presence was gone in an instant, but the scent of jasmine remained. And then he saw it. Sarah's eyelids fluttered, and her fingers, which had been still for 3 days, flexed in his hand. She woke up, not with a jolt, but with a quiet, peaceful awareness. Her eyes, clear and calm, found her father's face. She didn't speak, she just smiled. A slow, gentle, forgiving smile that washed over him like a wave of grace. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice a little hoarse. "The lady in blue said I could wake up now." Her words, a quiet echo of the last time he saw her, were a confirmation, a testament to a miracle that was not just in her healing, but in his own. The town was shocked by Sarah's recovery. The doctors had no explanation. They called it a medical anomaly, a miracle. But for the people of redemption, it was a sign. The whispers turned to stories, and the stories turned to a collective resolve. The town needed to heal. It needed to be whole again. And so, they came to Pastor Sam's door, not with torches, but with tools. They came to him, a man they had every right to hate, and they offered him forgiveness. They wanted to rebuild what he had broken. They wanted to restore the Madonna statue. And so, Pastor Sam, a man who had once tried to destroy the statue, now became its caretaker. He worked with the townsfolk, not as a leader, but as one of them. He brought his own tools, and he worked side by side with the people he had once condemned. He worked with the statue's followers, with the quiet believers, with the townspeople who had been torn apart by his actions. He listened to their stories, their pain, their hopes. He learned their names, and they learned his. They sanded, they polished, they touched up the paint. They found a new strength in their shared purpose. As they worked, the statue became a canvas for the town's healing. The cracks in the bronze, the tiny flaws, were not painted over but left as a testament to the statue's endurance. The statue was restored, but not to its original state. It was a new, stronger, more beautiful version of itself, a symbol not of perfection, but of grace, forgiveness, and the beauty of being made whole again. The day of the statue's rededication was not a public rally or a protest. It was a simple, quiet gathering. The town square was not filled with angry chants, but with the quiet hum of conversation and the soft glow of 100 candles. Pastor Sam stood at the base of the statue, his hands clasped, a man who had lost everything and found something more. He didn't preach. He didn't have a sermon. He simply told his story, a story of a man who thought he was saving a town from sin, but was truly only saving himself from pride. He spoke of his own arrogance, his own brokenness, and the miracle that had brought him to his knees. He spoke of the Madonna statue not as an idol, but as a symbol of the love that had healed his family and his town. The town of redemption was redeemed, not by fire or fury, but by the quiet power of forgiveness. The statue stood in the town square, a silent guardian, a witness to a miracle that was not just in her endurance, but in the community's ability to heal and forgive. The final miracle was not just in the statue's unyielding spirit, but in the town's quiet courage to admit when it was wrong. And Pastor Sam, a man who had once seen the world in terms of black and white, could now see it in the beautiful, complex colors of a community that had found its way back home. He was a new kind of pastor, a new kind of man, a new kind of father, a new kind of Christian. His faith was no longer a fire but a light, a gentle, healing light that shone from the very heart of a statue that he had once tried to destroy.